presentation. So we're going to jump right into it. And because we have a lot to cover, I just want to give you an idea of where we're going. So I'm going to touch just briefly on some of the safety statistics and talk about the scope of the issue we're facing. I'm going to give a little bit of background on some of the social psychology that is underlying this research. I'm going to talk about existing research and evidence for bias in the transportation context, talk about my survey instrument, what I developed to do this research. Then we'll go into the survey results, looking at the explicit and implicit attitudes. Then we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into drivers who bicycle or not, and a second one looking at the attitudes about overtaking bicyclists, which is an important safety-related behavior. Finally, I'm going to wrap up with some implications for practice and next steps of the research, and then we'll open it up for questions. So, we have some serious challenges related to serious injuries of deaths of both bicyclists and pedestrians. So these are some numbers you can keep in mind. In 2014, we're talking about almost 5,000 pedestrians killed, 12 per day, and 65,000 injuries. Bicyclists, about 2 per day, an injury every 10.5 minutes. And, so this is a significant public health issue. And, outside of the moral and public health issues, it's also an economic burden. So between lost work productivity and healthcare costs, we're looking at billions of dollars a year spent on injuries and fatalities. And then also one thing that I think we don't know nearly enough about is the long-lasting effects of these, significant number of injuries and what it does to people's quality of life. So, just starting to keep in mind what are the issues and why are we all here interested in this today. So part of the issue when we're talking about crashes, of course, is that vulnerable road users are, by definition, not encased in the bodywork of metal, so they're not protected when there's a crash. So this is data from here in Portland, Oregon. So this is looking at traffic crashes, keeping in mind that a traffic crash involves an automobile. So these are not, bicyclist falls or, pedestrian falls or anything like that. So when there's automobiles only involved in a crash, either with 2 cars hitting each other, 2 drivers hitting each other, or hitting static objects, 60% of the time there's only property damage. But when there's a bicyclist or pedestrian involved, that number for an injury or fatality is 93% of the time because of that vulnerability. So now I'm just going to focus on bicyclists mostly for the rest of the webinar. This is data from 2013 in the US, but fully half of the crashes that, or the fatalities that happen between in traffic crashes with drivers and bicyclists happen during the daytime, and another approximately quarter happen in the evening. So this is, largely a function of that's when people are riding, so they're just more exposed to, being in crashes. There's a higher likelihood of it. But I do think it also speaks to the fact that this isn't just an issue of visibility or lighting or high-vis clothing. So there's other mechanisms going on that are leading to these crashes. So this is data from the UK, but I think because of our similarities with infrastructure and road design and even car culture, there's probably good reason to believe that the numbers are pretty similar here. So just looking over here at the left side, these are attributions for crashes between bicyclists and drivers. So almost, or about two-thirds of the crashes are attributed to not drinking, not visibility, but these issues of looked but failed to see, which I'll go a little bit more into in a minute, misjudgment, or just inattention. And when you take out the nighttime and visibility issues, you take out drunk drivers and things, looking just at the daytime unimpaired driver over here, we start to see this, really significant. It's essentially split between this looked but failed to see and misjudgment or inattention. So I'd like to, look a little bit deeper, and this is kind of what led me into this work, is what is going on, what are the mechanisms behind these looked but failed to see and inattention. So this video, I'm just going to show you a quick 1-minute video because it's illustrative, and I would like you to, this is a test of your attention, so just focus on the players in the white shirts and count how many passes are made between them. So each team is passing a basketball back and forth. So count the number of passes by the team in white and no shouting out the answer if you already know. Okay, so now this is a little bit unusual just because you know that we're talking about attention and everybody's sitting right in front of their computer, so you may have all seen the gorilla. But if you didn't, don't feel bad, because in multiple lab studies, fully half of the people did not see the gorilla. And what this helped demonstrate was that we don't process everything in our visual environment. We can't. There's too much to take in. So our brains are constantly making decisions, usually subconsciously, about what we attend to, what we process. So when you have this, you're directing your attention at this task with the white shirts, you might miss something that's, there was plenty of time to see the gorilla. So this term, and this actually predates this video research, but this idea of inattentional blindness. So rather than a lack of attention, like you're attending to your cell phone rather than looking out of your car, it's a psychological or cognitive lack of attention. And the outcome of that is you fail to perceive an unexpected stimulus in plain sight, like a gorilla walking through a basketball game. And I think it's important to think about and keep in mind this unexpected part of this definition, because in places where, for instance, there might not be a lot of bicyclists, so they're not expected, or if a driver does not themselves bicycle, they might not be expecting to look for bicyclists, and so even if they have time physically to see them, their brain may not be processing them. So could that be potentially part of, or a significant part of, what it's behind this looked but failed to see crashes? So there's been multiple lab tests that show, again, drivers, just like us humans in many other contexts, we don't recall or see everything in our visual environment, even things that are critical. So things like, oh my gosh, this kid dashed out in traffic in front of me, right? So this, the researchers in the second quote talking about this looked but failed to see, again, it's not the physical environment. It's not necessarily my windshield pillar of my car blocked my view, or it's not just that there was a poor line of sight, but actually where drivers are looking and or their mental processing of things in the visual environment. So inattention, we've known for a long time, or attention, this is a quote from back in 1890, that attention creates no idea. We have to have an idea of something before we can attend to it. So where attention is this is the full quote here, an effect, not a cause, a product, not an agent. So then that raises the question, are certain types of ideas, more important in helping us know where to look and helping our brains process information? So that's kind of what set me up on this path. And a very important type of attitude, type of idea is attitudes, right? And we use that word a lot, but it's good to remember kind of what is an attitude. So it's an evaluation of a person, object, etc. And it's usually considered a tendency to evaluate with favor or disfavor, right? So we're familiar with, I like coffee, or I don't like beer, etc. But attitudes they have multiple components, an affective and a behavioral and a cognitive component. There's conscious and unconscious aspects. They can affect these mental models and processing, like I've been talking about, and direct attention. And so talking about these different components, the conscious and subconscious, in psychology they're referred to as explicit and implicit attitudes. So explicit attitudes are, they're deliberate, we can self-report them. I can say, yes, this is how I feel about this thing, or what I believe about this thing. And then implicitly, they're below conscious awareness. So things like stereotypes that are just automatically activated or triggered by things in our environment, and we may not even be aware of them. So the research has shown that implicit and explicit attitudes are distinct but related. So that we can hold sometimes explicit and implicit attitudes about the same object or concept, but they aren't congruent. So for instance, you can have, oh, I think bicycling is great for the environment, and and I really believe that, I do, but implicitly still feel like, but bicyclists, they really shouldn't block traffic, and so, this negative idea about their right to the road. And it's important because implicit attitudes have been shown to be better predictors of behaviors when there's like a lot of time pressure, you're running late, or there's a high cognitive load. It's a very complex task, there's a lot going on. I think it's easy to argue that the roadway environment is one of the most complex environments, and driving one of the most complex tasks that we all do, right? So most of us aren't airline pilots, but almost all of us drive. It's also a better predictor of behavior when there's like prejudice or nonverbal behaviors, which again, very much of our roadway interactions are nonverbal, right? Because especially when you're inside a car, you're just using nonverbal cues to figure out what other people's intentions are or to signal your own. So in the transportation context specifically, there's good research that drivers make decisions consciously or subconsciously about, how to respond to, say, pedestrians in the environment. So a study out of the Bay Area where the fancier the car, the less likely they were to yield, and it fits with kind of what we know about social dominance or even just value of time, like people who make more money value their time at greater rates. And then research that I was part of here with some colleagues in Portland and then since has been expanded and replicated in Vegas, drivers displaying racially biased yielding behaviors. Now again, we didn't stop drivers, so this could these aren't necessarily implicit, they could be explicit decision making, but there's good evidence that these things are happening, especially because they're happening at speed below our conscious awareness. Again, there's research on this drivers making decisions about how to behave differently with different types of bicyclists. So one of the more famous of them is Ian Walker from the UK in 2007 about, he instrumented a bicycle and how they pass closely or not, depending on whether they perceive the bicyclist as a man or a woman or helmeted or not. And then another study that they did where it was only the police video recording in progress where drivers gave them greater passing distance. And again, we can only speculate about how why these decisions are being made. Do drivers think, helmeted people or men are more competent and less likely to swerve, so they pass more closely, etc. We don't know, but the point is that there are decisions being made. And our mode affects how we see the world. So great study by some researchers out of the Netherlands and UK, where there were these child actors and they were playing on a playground, and from a car, people were like, oh, there's about a fight about to break out, and it's threatening. But when they saw it as a passerby on foot, this is video, they're like, oh, they're playing, they're just joking around, because they could hear things, they could read other cues. And then the only other study I'm aware of using this looking at the implicit bias in different roadway users was out of some folks at MIT who found that even when people say they think riding the bus is good, if they implicitly had like car pride, or again, thought the bus is for, whatever, not for them, for poor people or whatever, it's a lesser use, then they actually did drive more and ride the bus less. So that brings me to my own method for digging into these issues. The study was online only so that I could do this cognitive test. My survey looked at explicit attitudes, asked some self-report behaviors, and then demographics. This implicit association test, which tests implicit attitudes, and the survey was hosted and the IIT was built to my specifications by Project Implicit, which is a nonprofit that works on implicit bias. So the implicit association test is the most common method of testing these implicit cognitions. It's essentially a response latency test, which means it measures how long it takes you to answer. And it's a sorting task. So you're given these two concepts, and in this case it was a driver and a bicyclist, which I used both the words and then these images. And then these attributes, which are, in this case, the simplest one, which I use, are these positive and negative evaluations, so joyful, lovely versus painful, terrible. The most common used word lists actually include things like rage and anger, but I took those out because I didn't want to specifically trigger the idea of, say, road rage and kind of skew my results. You'll notice that these are pretty visibly male bicyclists and drivers. I tried to go for gender neutral images, but in the pre-testing it didn't work. Humans are so tuned in to try and assign gender. So to keep it simple, I just went with men for this round, and future research will test other social identities like gender and race. So here's just a screenshot quickly of what you see as a respondent. You're kind of told you're going to sort these things, and there's multiple trials which they do because, one, you become your own control. So if you're just generally a little bit slow to respond, that gets accounted for. And then also it switches, so say you're right-hand dominant, sometimes you're sorting the bicyclist with your right, sometimes the driver, so that it can take into account that. So this is what you see when you're taking it if you've never taken one of these. So in this case, you'd say, oh, it's a bicyclist, so I sort with my right hand. Then next, a word might pop up that's either joyful or terrible, and then I have to sort that appropriately. And the whole basis of this is that concepts that are more closely associated in your mind, you can sort faster. So in this case, with this screenshot, if you're able to very quickly sort bicyclist or a negative word, then those things are more closely linked. And again, you would see flipped version of this where you'd have trials where you're sorting driver and negative or bicyclist or positive. So just talk about who answered. My survey was live for 6 weeks on the public site, and I got a total of 776 people, which is pretty good. About 2/3 women, which is common for survey research, and no significant difference in the age. And then I got a nice age distribution of respondents. I didn't know, sometimes you have a test like this, you don't know if it's going to be all college students taking it for credit, but it was a nice distribution. And then this is where the responses came from. The black are a county with at least one response, so a decent smattering of answers from all over the country. And like I wanted, I was able to target experienced frequent drivers. So on the left, 3/4 of my sample have been driving 10 years or more. The people who'd been driving fewer were just younger, and so they'd had less time to be licensed. On the right, they were very frequent drivers. So 87% of the respondents drive 4 to 7 days a week, and as you can see, 57% drive 7 days a week, which is what I wanted. I wanted people who drive a lot and who are likely to potentially encounter bicyclists and also have opinions. And most people did indeed report that they see bicyclists when they're driving. So I think this is like 84% or something say they see bicyclists at least occasionally. And again, this is self-reported. So I can't tease out some of my things about, well, like, are people driving and just not mentally processing bicyclists? But that's an issue for another study. But I did want to at least know that people have the chance to interact with bicyclists. And then I wanted to know, okay, do they themselves bicycle? On the left there, I was maybe a little bit surprised that over half of my respondents had indeed bicycled. And I said bicycled outside because I wanted to separate it from like a spin class. But then when I asked of those, that 54% of those people who said yes, they've bicycled in the last year, okay, well, in a typical week with nice weather, how many days do you bicycle? And almost half still said 0. So they've been on a bicycle, but they don't necessarily bicycle frequently, and then on from there. And then that 3% that you see that are very frequent bicyclists, that only represents 11 people in my sample. So it was a pretty small number of people who are bicycle that frequently. So on to the results. Okay, so this is my one messy big slide. Don't worry too much about it. I don't usually like to put up a table, but the important thing about this is the middle box here is the explicit attitude questions that I asked people, and you're gonna get a chance to look at these in the next few slides. But what I did is I ran an exploratory factor analysis, and what that allows me to do is see that do these questions that I asked group together in any way? Like, are they associated together? And indeed they are, and quite strongly, some of them. So what I then did was I gave those factors, as we call them, these groupings, a name based on the psychological theory. So these questions all group together. I'm a skilled driver. Being a driver is an important part of who I am. I care if my friends and family think of me as a good driver. So based on the social psychological theory, I gave that factor the name driver identity and so forth. So you can kind of just keep this in the back of your mind as we go forward. So looking at the explicit attitude results split up by those factors I just mentioned, so all the questions were asked from strongly disagree to strongly agree, strongly disagree to strongly agree from 1 to 6. They were not offered a neutral point, but if you were to take the mean of that, 3.5 is the kind of the middle point that you could say is neutral. So that's what the black bar represents. So the darker orange it is, the more kind of pro-driver the attitude, and on the next slides you'll see some ones that are brown, and so the darker brown it is, the more pro-bicyclist, I would say. So skilled driver, again, people pretty resoundingly agreed that yes, they're skilled driver. Kind of more maybe than I expected, said it's an important part of who they are, and people do care, and this fits very much with what we know kind of about norms. And then the system justification, I called it, So this one was a little bit surprising just from maybe what we hear anecdotally. People did indeed actually say, because you'll have to be careful about the wording here. I had to reverse code some of these things so they're all on the same scale. But this basically means that people think that building infrastructure for bikes is a good investment of public funds, right? So they're disagreeing with the negative. I didn't, however, ask them, do you think it's a good idea even if it meant giving up parking spots in front of your house, or even if it meant living with some more potholes, etc. So they didn't have to make any kind of trade-off. This was an abstract thing, but it was heartening to see that people, do actually think it's a good use of public funds. And then the rest of these were pretty much neutral, and this is for the whole sample. We'll dive into these a little more. Social dominance, there was mean agreement on all of these, some of these getting towards stronger agreement about bicycles shouldn't hold up traffic, and people did report very much, even stronger than getting angry about bicyclists, about they're angry about seeing other drivers breaking the rules of the road. And then finally, this issue of road user legitimacy. And this is something that I think we see a lot in the comment sections of, say, articles about bicycling, but it didn't come out in my research. I thought, oh yeah, tons of people are going to say, yes, bicycles should have to pass a license test. They should have to register and pay taxes. And in general, there was a lot of kind of disagreement with those. So that was an interesting finding that I think why it's good to do sometimes survey research that isn't just looking at the comment sections. So looking at the implicit attitude results, so thinking back about the test, it was pretty normally distributed, which is nice from kind of a statistical standpoint. There was a little bit of a trend of more people having that preference for driver, but there was, almost 20% of my sample did implicitly favor bicyclists over drivers, and then, 60% weak or no preference. So, and then this is a correlation table, and the thing that's important to notice about this is just in this box here. So looking at, do these implicit and explicit attitudes, how do they relate to each other? Do they relate to each other? And this, what you see here is that they do statistically significantly relate to each other, but not very strongly. So the bigger this number towards 1 would be a stronger. So what that says to me is, like in other people have found, these attitudes are related, but they are distinct. So they're measuring different things. And when you tease out, some of the individual questions, this one in particular, being a driver is an important part of who I am, it's almost a perfect linear correlation, which means for people who strongly disagreed with that statement, they implicitly, subconsciously favored bicyclists. Who people strongly agreed that it's important part, they implicitly or subconsciously favored drivers, right? And so this might seem like, yeah, no kidding, but what it says to me is that my implicit method was indeed measuring people's implicit bias and wasn't just noise or random. So this, as a researcher, this is a heartening response. So looking at, this case of drivers who bicycle or not, because this is something that as planners or engineers or advocates were interested in, I wanted to see, well, do they differ and how? So when I looked at drivers who have and have not bicycled outside in the last year, they differed significantly by the system justification measure and the road user legitimacy. So again, thinking about, I don't see people similar to me, they shouldn't block traffic, and then this issue of registering. But do notice that these numbers are still mean disagreements. So people aren't necessarily all thinking that even drivers who don't bicycle don't necessarily think that people should register and pay taxes, etc. But what's important about this is that relationship that we just saw is actually just due to drivers who bicycle regularly. So what it really is not the drivers who bicycled at least once in the last year, it's the drivers who bicyclist at least once a week in that nice weather. And that's where you see this mean, difference of driver non-bicyclists are more likely to be pro-driver and, justifying the automobile system, and again, getting towards better agreement with this road user legitimacy. And the effect size would just mean like, okay, how important or how sizable is this difference? And it's actually a pretty medium size, which is a pretty decent difference. So there is a real difference between drivers who bicycle regularly or not. And again, this fits intuitively, but it's nice to see it play out in the research. So then when you look at this bicycling frequency and the implicit biases, you see a very similar relationship. So I dropped all those moderate or those weak or no preference implicit bias people and I looked just at the people who had moderate to strong preference for either the bicyclist or the driver implicitly, and then I compared that to whether they bicycle outside in the last year. So if they have, it's like an almost perfect 50-50 split between whether they implicitly prefer bicyclist or driver. But if they haven't, then they're much more likely to be someone who has preference for a driver. But again, it's when you look at the frequency. So when I split up the people who bike or not in that typical week, the people who bike one day or more, then you see where they actually are more likely to favor the bicyclist than driver implicitly. But the people who, even if they biked outside in the last year, if they don't bike in a typical week, their relationship basically looks like people who don't bicycle at all, right? So their likelihood of being in one group or the other implicitly is the same as if they hadn't bicycled at all. So, and that may be partly or largely explained by why people who have ridden in the last year have ridden. And I asked people, and about half the sample had ridden only for recreation. So this very well could be that they drove to a trail and they never rode on a street. And so while there's a lot of good benefits for that, this kind of says, well, maybe the benefits don't include, kind of better attitudes towards on-street interactions with bicyclists when they're a driver. And then I just want to, I like to show this because this is kind of along the same lines where I asked people this open-ended question, what are 5 words or phrases that come to mind when you think of a bicyclist? And a word cloud, it's generated where the bigger the word, the more times it was mentioned by people. And I think it's very, kind of jumps out at you that people understand that bicycling is healthy and they understand that it's good for the environment. Like people get it. We don't need to keep, working on that messaging. But it also makes me wonder, can it be othering? So if you don't see yourself as that super fit person, for instance, does it mean that you're like, well, that's not really something I could even do or enjoy? So I think this is just something to keep in mind going forward. And then this issue of representation, when I teased out this or took out this one question, do you see bicyclists similar to me on city streets? The driver non-bicyclists, were much more likely to say, I don't see people similar to me on city streets with a pretty decent effect size. I don't know which direction this flows, right? Is it because, do people bicycle because they're like, oh, those people are like me, I can do that? Or do people see people like themselves when they do something? So I don't know which direction this is, but this result definitely came out that when people are, people who don't bicycle look at bicyclists and they're like, no, those people aren't like me. So then I just want to wrap up with this behavior section, which looking at some safety-related behaviors and in particularly overtaking or, when a driver passes a bicyclist. So in what may be the world's most obvious findings, I asked people if they're a skilled driver, and fully 93% of my sample agreed with that. Yes, I am a skilled driver. But interestingly, people did admit, even though they view themselves as skilled generally, they did admit that they don't necessarily feel comfortable maneuvering around bicyclists, right? So I asked them, are you comfortable deciding how fast or close to pass if there's no bike lane? And 40% said I'm not. And then I said, is it difficult to judge how far a bicyclist is from your passenger side? And 46% said it's actually difficult for me to judge. So I think this is really important when we're talking about passing distance and 3-foot laws and everything, is even though the point of those laws isn't, like, oh, we need exactly 36 inches, the point is to get drivers to get more passing room. But I do think it is something worth to keep in mind that drivers, whether or not they admit it, may not have a good sense of just how far that is. And even more people, when I asked them about being nervous about, having to drive close to someone, 77% of my sample said it makes me nervous. And I think this is, people do have a sense that they have this potential to cause harm with their car. They're not, immune, and most people don't want to hurt other people. And then this question of it startles me when a bicyclist comes up on the driver's side. So if you have a one-way street with a near side bike lane. And I think these are important, and I looked at them because, one, it can, this sense of okay, negative interactions because we're startled or we're nervous, and we may be more likely to, make mistakes or also just be angry with people because we kind of turn that fear into an anger about, well, you shouldn't be on the road because you make me nervous. But this, looking again at these, bicycling frequencies, it definitely improved with the more bicycling that people did. So people who didn't bicycle at all versus it was improved by if they biked in the last year but they're not necessarily typical bicyclists, and then improved even more if they bike once in the typical week. So, I mean, again, I think this kind of just makes sense intuitively, but it also speaks to this idea that, you know, I think we need to better understand just how much bicycling and how to get more people on for these. You know, they don't have to be long trips. They don't have to be a 7-day-a-week commuter, but, you know, maybe a bike share trip once a week at lunch, or, you know, maybe focusing on that 1-day-a-week shopping trip, or if there's frequent open streets events, is that enough? And I think these are unanswered questions. Again, this is something that I think, you know, maybe isn't surprising, but is really important to think about and think about how we can change culturally, and also through design, and is this idea of this huge amount of pressure that drivers feel to not hold up traffic, right? I call it the 11th commandment, thou shalt not hold up traffic. So, you know, a good portion of my sample feels that, you know, other drivers will get angry if they don't pass, and that can lead, you know, that pressure can lead to maybe unsafe passing maneuvers, or even just, you know, set the intimidation or getting too close, you know, not necessarily overtly intimidating, but just behaviors that bicyclists, this is this feeling of like, oh, why are they, you know, riding my tail? I have the right to be here. Even there's a sharrow, I have the right to be in the street, but there's just this huge sense from the driver that, you know, that other drivers are angry if they don't pass the bicyclists. So then I wanted to look at these same safety behaviors and see if the implicit bias gave me any additional information. And so when I looked at, you know, kind of controlled for all the different variables I had, the implicit bias didn't actually give me, you know, it didn't better predict how people answered those previous questions I just went about, you know, passing, being nervous or etc. But it did help explain when people reported checking for bicyclists before they make a turn. And again, these are all self-report behaviors. But the more pro-driver or a person was implicitly, the less likely they were to check for bicyclists before making a turn. And that's a serious, you know, potential safety concern. And then it also improved prediction of drivers believe who's at fault in a collision. So the more pro-driver they were subconsciously, the more likely it is that they don't think a driver is at fault when there's a collision between a driver and a bicyclist. So just to kind of wrap up, you know, I raised probably more questions than I answered, as with any good research for, you know, job security, but there's some implications for practice from this, right? So I think a lot remains to be learned about these cognitive processes, especially the socially related ones, right, as a function of our, you know, our gender and our race and our class and our mode, and learn about these cognitive processes of drivers towards vulnerable road users, because there's, you know, a lot of research in other domains, but it hasn't seen a ton of use yet in the transportation context. Some of this, like these social cognitions, may help explain, you know, the build it and they will come, and why that fails sometimes, and or why different types of vulnerable road users experience the same street design differently or have different interactions and qualitative experiences. I think it also demonstrates that, you know, implicit methods can add value to traditional survey methods, especially when you have sensitive issues or interactions that, you know, happen at high speed, high stress situations. And like I mentioned, I think, you know, evidence is growing that, and again, it fits kind of anecdotally, that getting people on bikes frequently can help improve these attitudes and hopefully the behaviors. But questions remain about how much, how frequent, what kind of experience does it take to shift kind of your attitudes and potentially increase familiarity with what bicyclists are doing and some empathy about what it's like on the road. And then, you know, just this idea, okay, so can design by slowing, you know, certainly by slowing interactions, it allows our executive function to step in and outweigh our biases and make better decisions. Also separating users, of course, kind of removes the danger of these negative interactions where it's possible. It's a question of, you know, how does design and how much and for how long does it shift explicit, implicit attitudes? And then these cultural issues of like legitimizing roadway users. So, you know, it's not just my road, or, you know, you're not just holding up my route, etc. So I just, I kind of want to wrap up here by acknowledging, you know, my committee members, and then NITC for funding this particular study, and the Federal Highway Administration Eisenhower Fellowship for funding my dissertation work more generally. And then with that, I'm going to wrap it up and say thank you and take questions.
Great, thank you, Tara. Great presentation. We do have a few questions coming in, but feel free to continue to submit your questions if you have any, and I'll go ahead and get started with some of them that we do have. So there's been a couple questions on your surveys and the methodology. So can you go into more detail on how and where you promoted your survey and how you got rarely cycling drivers to respond? Often some of these surveys can skew towards the more frequent cyclists.
Sure, that's a great question. So let me see if I can get out of this and just go back to that area of let's see, where's my survey? So this survey is definitely unique. It has a unique type of self-selection bias. So what I did is Project Implicit has this public site where, however, through the news, through a class, however it is, people find out about this site and they go and they say, okay, I want to take a test of implicit bias. And I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm interested. So there's self-selection in the sense that these people are opting in to taking a survey. They have no idea what it's going to be about. It could be about race, it could be about age, it could be about politics. So, and certainly implicit bias in particular has gotten a little bit more attention in the news lately, and it was mentioned in at least one of the presidential debates and I think the vice presidential debates. So people hear about it, they go on, they log in. Once they're there, they're randomly assigned to one of the tests that's active, and there could be, or surveys that's active, there could be anywhere from a few dozen maybe that are active, and something like, I forget, I need to look at the exact numbers, but it's like 8,000 people registered at this site in the course of my survey. So that's quite a lot. That's, it's a good mix. And what I do have is information about, because I have their demographics from before they even start my survey. And there was no real difference in the people that saw so they get randomly assigned, they see my letter, it says, welcome to this is going to be about drivers and bicyclists, we'd like to get your opinions. And so then people would either opt out or not. And the people that opted out were not significantly different than the people who stuck around, which is good. So there's not something about my study that all of a sudden people were leaving for. So, people saw that and they were already there and they may have an opinion about this, but that was the concern, I think, was what someone's alluding to, is that, okay, just people who are, quote unquote, avid cyclists might want to take this, but people stuck around. And so then they take this implicit test and then that leads them to the survey and they go through there. So when I looked at, and I don't think I have the table, but when I looked at the comparison of the people who took the survey versus the, kind of the general U.S. population, because that's all I can compare it to because it's from people all over the country, it was a little bit more, the sample was a little bit more educated, which I think is a constant issue with survey research, especially online survey research. Like I said, there was more women, but that's common in survey research. But generally, it was it was a pretty good approximation of the U.S. Population. So yeah, that's how people got to the survey. So it's, like I said, it's kind of a weird kind of self-selection bias where they were someone who was definitely interested in taking a survey, but that's usually what happens. But they didn't know until they got into it that it was necessarily going to be about drivers and bicyclists. And so I think, when you just, so it's not random, but it's kind of random-ish, and so many people drive that that's actually probably not that uncommon to get those kind of numbers.
Okay, great. And you alluded to this a little bit in that response, but can you go into more detail on the level of education of your sample and then also locations of your respondents? Did you see any trends? For example, we hear a lot in the South about people's strong connections to cars and car culture, and was there any data points in that direction?
Right. So my sample was slightly more likely to have a bachelor's degree than the U.S. population, and I think slightly more likely to have an advanced degree, but it's not like the whole sample was loaded that way, and unfortunately I just don't have that that table to show that. But that is something I think it's a challenge, a frequent challenge in survey research is people who have maybe the time or they're college educated who have heard about this through some way. As far as the spatial data, this is one of those things that unfortunately I have to say like hold tight because it's it's certainly a part of this study, but I haven't been able to parse the data very well yet. So one of the things I'm plan on doing is kind of looking at this a couple different ways. We're looking at kind of these larger regional differences towards, say, implicit favoring of cars or some of these explicit measures of being more kind of pro-driver and pro-car system. But then also looking at, tying it to, say, like the EPA database or other measurements of infrastructure. So I can look at, and again, just haven't been able to do this yet, but looking at places where there's a higher density of bike infrastructure, how are people's attitudes differently or their self-reported behaviors. And then also I'll be able to look a little bit at these issues I raised of inattentional blindness or people not seeing or processing bicyclists, because if I know that there's someone who's driving in an area where there's a pretty good bike mode share, but they report that they don't really see bicyclists or interact with them, then there's some kind of disconnect there, right? So there's a lot of, I think interesting spatial, it's hard, I only have 676 responses for the whole country, so it's not like I can say just compare a Portland and an Atlanta or something like that, but it does give me a nice distribution, and I'll be looking at some of the bike-friendly designations, for example, as a way. And then also I have the data for, from the benchmarking report, many of you may be familiar with from the Alliance for Biking and Walking, where looking at the places where there's a high fatality rate for bicyclists or like a large gender gap in bicycling, because I think those just tell us different things about the environment and potentially tell us something about interactions between drivers and bicyclists.
Great. All right. Next question. Can you talk more about the potential connection between people being supportive of more or better bike infrastructure and people feeling uncomfortable driving around bicyclists without cues?
Yeah, so good question. So on a previous work I did, which was part of the larger Green Lane study of that was through NITC here, looking at protected bikeways or separated bikeways in the United States, I asked people, or we asked people in the survey, one about this question of supporting, building more bicycle facilities in their city, and then also this question of, interacting with other drivers, bicyclists, and pedestrians. And what was interesting about that is people were the most negative, who were the most negative about interacting with bicyclists, were also the least likely to support building more bike infrastructure. So on the one hand, you might think, oh, well, if you hate driving around bicyclists, you would love separated facilities, get them out of your way. But what we couldn't tease out from that data was, is it that people are, being kind of punitive? They're like, well, I don't like bicyclists, and so I don't think we should spend money on them. Is it, one of the questions we asked was about kind of scofflaw behavior or breaking the rules. So is the thing, well, if you think bicyclists are just rule breakers, then why would you think they would use the facilities as designed? Unfortunately, we didn't have that information. But I think it could also have to do with, just a lack of familiarity and understanding of what more facilities do to help, better facilitate these interactions, so that if you are nervous, if you are concerned, it helps. You're like, no, this will be better. This will help us, have people be where they should be, or now I kind of know where you're going to be and know what I need to do. And of course, there's, disagreements, I think, or differences of opinion about how much of that should be done with, say, design versus just using design to slow people down. And so do you like overly prescribe movements, or do you slow people down so that they can interact with each other? And I think, there's good points on both sides of those arguments, or on that whole spectrum of arguments. But I think, this is a pretty simple study. It was a pretty short survey, just by the nature of needing to be short enough to get people to complete it. And so I think there's a lot of room to look at teasing out, because I hadn't really seen it in the literature, these issues of like fear and nervousness, and then how that might translate to, okay, well, look, this, these facilities can help alleviate that. We can make you feel more comfortable by providing bikes with better facilities.
Okay, great. All right. So it could be interesting to split the geography among regions across the country, but also if you could split between urban and rural. Was your data, were you able to get any kind of information from your survey responses regarding those kind of splits?
Yeah, so great question. That's something I'll be looking at as well. So what I have for each respondent is a zip code. So that's why it's taken a bit of time to kind of tease out, like, okay, if I just have a zip code, how do I make these designations about where they are? And I didn't ask them, where do you live, where do you work, where do you drive every day? So I'm just kind of having to, make some assumptions, which is fine. But so I will be looking, because I think that is an important issue. And I think, as a little bit of a editorializing side note, I think there's so much interesting work to be done looking at smaller and medium-sized communities that have a lot of potential for being good for biking and walking trips, but then understanding some of these different car culture issues and just familiarity issues. So I think it'll be, again, it's a good question, and I'll be looking at that with this spatial data as best I can with the data I have. And it looks like I have kind of a related question of why did I choose to work on the whole U.S. and not just take, focus on one or two areas. So I went back and forth about this, and just to be frank, it was just kind of expedient with the way that Project Implicit does. I basically had the opportunity of, okay, do you want to focus on a couple cities and risk not getting nearly as many responses, or do you want to try and get a lot of responses, because these are, just looking at these questions for the first time, some of them. And so I just kind of opted out of expedience to do their public site, which is open, it was open to all the U.S. I think very much, next steps. One of the things is I have this whole survey instrument on a private link now that I can continue to use for research. And I think it'll be interesting to do some more targeted work in cities where I can more directly compare, their amount of facilities, bicycle facilities, and number of bicyclists and things like that.
All right, great. All right, were you able to factor in safe passing laws in various states and how aware drivers are by driver exams? Do safe passing vehicle license plates have an impact?
Oh, so a couple good questions in there. I think that's something I have not, but as I dig more into the spatial data, that is something that I can basically, create another variable that says, does this person live in a state or not that has a safe passing law? I can say, well, how long has this law been in place? Is it newer, or is it, been around longer? I'm not familiar with the safe passing vehicle license plate, so I'll have to look at that. I assume that means some kind of actual safe passing that speak to that, rather than just like a share the road kind of idea. But I will definitely look at that. And, it's something I talked about. I presented some of this work, earlier bits of this work in Australia this summer, where they have a meter matters. So there's a big focus on really, expanding this work with the 3-foot passing laws or the safe distance laws. And so I think we're just kind of at the beginning of understanding, the effects that those have and how to make those, the really kind of best that they can be, and in what different contexts. So, I mean, again, I think it has a lot to do with, like, depending on the context in a super urban area where you're not necessarily get the larger passing distance, but if you've effectively slowed vehicles down and slow drivers down, then you can interact, more safely, and again, not falling back on these implicit attitudes and biases. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just looking at the questions here on the side. So yeah, so this is something, I had a question about sharing the survey and partnering with some targeted studies. Kind of the answer to the latter part is yes. The answer to the former part is I'm still working that out. So I'm in the stage of wrapping up this. So this is part of my dissertation work, wrapping that up, and kind of figuring out, like, where does it land on, like, okay, I'm going to embargo this till I can publish it and come out with it. keeping some level of kind of control over it. But of course, I also believe very much in kind of open science and replication. So please do contact me if you're interested. And this is going to be something that I have plans in my next kind of stages of research after my PhD here to do some targeted area. I'd really like to do some cross-cultural. Looking at different countries, so looking at, say, the UK, where it's more similar to us, and the Netherlands, where they have very different, approaches and culture. And then, like I said, future work looking at, additional social identities that will intersect with mode, like race and gender. And then, kind of one of my bigger goals is to try and tie this to behavior more directly, through kind of a combination of, some driving simulator work, maybe some naturalistic studies with instrumented vehicles, etc. And I think, of course, this kind of whole newish world of autonomous vehicles and all the things, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how some of this may play into understanding how drivers, as we look at partial autonomy, interact with people outside the vehicle. So that's a long answer to a short question, but yes, I think there's a lot more to be done with this work. Of course I do, I'm biased, implicitly and explicitly biased towards this, but please do contact me if you're interested.
All right, great, Tara. Thank you so much. I think we'll take this opportunity to wrap up the webinar at this point. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. In your chat message box, you should see a link for a survey. We'd really appreciate, obviously, your responses. And we will also be sending out the link for the video and the presentation slides in our follow-up email tomorrow. So we'll look for that. You can also view our other professional development offerings on our website at nitc-utc.net. And this concludes our webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for coming.